Hello, welcome to the Nutmeg from the Evening Standard, where we get together and talk about the weekend's football and the matches we've been to. I'm Dan Kilpatrick. I'm joined as ever by Jack Rosser, James Robson and Simon Collings to discuss all the Premier League action from our London clubs. We'll start with Tottenham and Gareth Bale. I was at the Spurs stadium yesterday and it's safe to say Bale is officially back. Or maybe not, maybe it was just Burnley, but 2 goals against the Clarets in a 4-0 win and a really encouraging performance, including a great 50-yard assist for Harry Kane as well. He was also involved in the 4th goal, which was scored by Lucas Moura. And there was this lovely moment where he burst down the touchline. He beat Charlie Taylor with a kind of mic-on move, a sort of push and run as he rolled back the years, which I think was just as encouraging as the goals, and really suggested he is getting his form and fitness back. Obviously, Bale's return to Spurs on loan from Real Madrid, which happened 5 months ago, has kind of been coloured by these doubts and disagreements over his fitness. Mourinho's appeared to grow frustrated at his condition. James, do you think Bale's return to form, if we can call it that, after, I suppose, 1.5 really positive Premier League matches, but do you think his return to form shows Mourinho's handled him well, or perhaps that Mourinho should have been more proactive at playing him sooner?
Yeah, I think it's that classic situation, really, wherever Jose Mourinho is involved, that there are 2 ways of looking at this. I'm sure if you sat down with Jose last night, he'd be feeling pretty satisfied, and he'd probably say, look, this is what I knew Bale could do. This is why I was pushing him. This is why I hung him out to dry, if you like. That's why he needed the tough love, because this player was in there all along, and he just needed coaxing out of him, and I did it. I would imagine others would look at it and say, you really should have been playing Bale all along. This has been what Spurs have been missing. This is what he could have done if you just trusted in him earlier. I don't know the answer to it. I suppose the fact that it's come so soon after what looked like they probably reached a point of no return, to be totally honest, just a couple of weeks ago. If you think after that Everton game and then the press conference that he did later that week, you thought, this is curtains for Bale. You know, this is an absolutely disastrous return to Spurs. But you've got to say credit to Bale for the performances he's put in since then. And who knows, maybe he just needed that last boot up the backside, I suppose, to not to put too fine a point on it, from Jose.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that Bale's kind of returned to form, and he has also been really impressive in both legs of the Europa League against Wolfsburg as well, albeit they were quite limited opposition. But this kind of return has followed both Mourinho digging him out before the Everton game, which he missed, not through injury, Mourinho said, but because he had some feelings, which felt quite poignant at the time. And also after his agent, Jonathan Barnett, said recently that he was coming to the end of his career. So you wonder if Bale kind of had the twin motivations of proving them both wrong. But Mourinho was asked about his role in the turnaround last night and managed to keep a straight face when he said, I'm not the kind of guy to take credit for that kind of thing. And I've got to say, I think I probably come down on the side of Mourinho's handled this reasonably well. Like, I think Bale just didn't look fit on the opportunities that he had. He just didn't look like a guy who trusted his body and was willing to kind of push himself through brick walls, which is what Mourinho demands. So I can totally understand why he wasn't playing. On the flip side, I think that whole performance for Spurs was kind of tinged with frustration, really. It was enjoyable, it was exhilarating, but you just couldn't help but think, firstly, why didn't they play like this in more games? Why didn't they go for the jugular against more sides? I'm thinking of the draws against Crystal Palace and Wolves and Fulham. But also, why didn't Bale get a chance sooner? And we might never really know, as you said, what the answer to that is. But nonetheless, it was really pleasant to see him back.
If Mourinho has handled this well and he plays a significant role across the last 13, 14 games of the season and in the cups and in Europe as well, what makes his sort of return a success, do you think, Dan? Because obviously it's not going to be a couple of nice goals against Wolfsburg and that performance against Burnley. That won't mark it as a success, given the wages that Tottenham are having to contribute towards. What do you think he needs to do between now and the end of the season to make it a success and maybe consider it being prolonged?
Well, yeah, I was thinking about this last night, and his only league starts so far have come against West Brom, Brighton, and Burnley. And obviously, if the season finished that way, it would be really disappointing. You'd look back at it and think, who did he really hurt in the Premier League? And I think he has to have a kind of landmark performance against a big side. Obviously already Spurs fans are starting to think about the League Cup final. If they've got Bale in this form with Kane and Son, can they pull off a shock and really hurt City? And you've got to say, that's the front three that everyone dreamed of when he came back to the club in the summer. Obviously, Kane and Son were flying in autumn, and they also looked really good alongside Bale and Lucas yesterday. So, I do think there's potential there to hurt big sides, but I think he's got to do it in a big, meaningful, decisive game, and whether that's a game in the league to perhaps propel them back into European contention. The North London derby's coming up quite soon this month, or whether that's in the Europa League or even the League Cup final. I feel like he has to have a meaningful impact where it matters. Not against a Burnley or a Brighton or a West Brom.
I might be being really unrealistic here, but you can't take away how much he's costing Spurs, even though they're not paying his full, what we think is around 600,000 a week, reputedly at Real Madrid. Let's say conservatively it's in the region of £200,000 a week. Does he not have to play every week for that sort of money? What other players at Spurs are on that sort of money that would be in and out of the odd Europa League game to justify another season of that sort of outlay, even though there's not a transfer fee? Surely he's got to be playing the majority of the games and impacting the majority of the games.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. His wages have kind of largely, I would say, gone overlooked during this spell that he's barely played and barely contributed. I think partly that's because the view is that he kind of pays for himself in almost the feel-good factor. Whether you can get away with saying that, I'm not sure. And in commercial value as well. The fact that he is a genuine superstar, and Spurs signed him at the same time as the women's team signed Alex Morgan, and that they were seen, arguably as the two biggest signings in the club's history. So, and that's just for their kind of status and commercial value. So there is that element, but yeah, I agree with you. He's still the highest paid player in the Premier League. He's still the footballer in the Premier League that's earning the most money per week, whether that's coming from Spurs or Real Madrid. It is kind of irrelevant. So yes, he has to be impacting more matches, and I think we can now expect a lot more from him. He's shown what he's capable of, and he's set the bar at a certain level now, and he's got to stay fit and keep hitting that if he can. Moving from one 30s winger who's underperformed to another, Simon. That was a smooth segue. Willian performed well in Arsenal's 3-1 win at Leicester this weekend. A really big result for the Gunners that suggests, I suppose in the same way as Spurs, that they could have an upturn in the second half of the season. Similar kind of question, really. I mean, do you see that as a potential turning point for him? He's been such a much maligned signing since he came from Chelsea in the summer, or was this a kind of one-off impressive performance that we shouldn't get too excited about?
I was going to say that segue was about as slick as one of Spurs' counters yesterday, so it's nicely done. Willian, he wasn't quite as emphatic as Gareth Bale, but any Arsenal fan will tell you at the moment the bar with him is pretty low. That was his first Premier League start yesterday since December 19, so that gives you an idea of just quite how far down the pecking order he'd fallen. And Arteta before that had given him so many chances. Even after that trip to Dubai that took place in November time, he still kept his place in the team, and he's taken him out of the firing line. I think was perhaps wise. There's been a lot of criticism, and Arteta actually, credit to him, said it. It was fair because Willian hasn't been good enough. But I think we saw on Thursday night when he came off the bench, he looked a bit brighter. He looked like he was getting involved in the game more. Arteta was probably a bit overboard in that Benfica game, saying he sort of changed the game, which I think it's a bit of a stretch, seeing as he gave it to Tierney. Tierney beat two players and smashed it in the bottom corner. But you felt after that Benfica game, if there was ever a chance where he was going to get a start, it was going to be Leicester, because just the amount of goodwill towards him was so much higher than it has been. And I thought he looked so much brighter. He was influencing the game. His work off the ball, which is something Arteta, we know, prides in his players, was much, much better tracking back. And he finished the game with 2 assists. So for him, it feels like a defining moment. But I think, like with Bale, we need a bit of a bigger sample size before we start singing from the rooftops.
I think similarly, like we said to Bale, he's now got a chance to sort of rescue his season. Again, he's one that they've given a lot of money to in terms of wages and a long contract on 3 years. You know, Chelsea weren't willing to do that. But he's not someone that, despite that contract and despite the money, you sort of look to win you games. He was, you know, last season at Chelsea, he wasn't exactly spectacular, but he was one of Lampard's more reliable players, you know, always there and able to crop up in a big moment with an assist or a bit of experience. And now you're getting to the point in the season where Arsenal are leaning really heavily on the Europa League. That's where you'll need his experience. And if he can crop up in a couple of those moments, I think it's a chance for him to sort of salvage what has to this point been a rather underwhelming start to his Arsenal career, to be generous.
I could never understand last season why Chelsea were trying to extend that contract anyway, particularly when you look at the business they did in the summer. I just couldn't see where he'd fit in. You look at Chelsea now, they've got just a surplus of that type of player and they can't get them all in anyway. So, but from Arsenal's point of view, he looks to me like a problem that's going to be hanging around for a while. I know we've discussed this a few times on this show about their business with aging players, if you like. You know, I just think it's an area where they really need to get smarter, both in handing out contracts, i.e. Aubameyang, maybe Lacazette, but also in signing those sort of players. Because the model is there. When you look at clubs in Italy, they're doing it really well, the likes of Inter and AC Milan. They're really cleverly picking these aging players who are available for nothing and bringing them in, and they're performing still. If Willian is any example, and also Aubameyang, as far as Arsenal are concerned, it's an area they really need to buck up in.
Yeah, I understood the signing in the summer. I think I might have been one of the few people who actually wasn't overly opposed to bringing him in, simply because I felt like he made the team better instantly, or should have made the team better instantly. You know, he's got an immaculate injury record from his time at Chelsea. I think he always played at least, you know, well over 30 games a season. So I got that, and I appreciate the issue you have is giving him a 3-year deal, but I felt like that was the only way to get the deal done, and I thought you would get enough out of him in these first 2 years to justify that sort of third final year where he was a bit plot player. I agree the issue is, at the moment, you're looking at the contract and going, oh God, we've got, you know, 2.5 years left of him. But if he can contribute to the standard he was yesterday against Leicester on a regular basis, I think he's fine as a part of that squad. But James, I think, is right. Longer term, Arsenal do need to look at how they give those contracts out to senior players, because it does become an issue if you get to those last years and you're suddenly lumbered with a player who's on big money and not really contributing.
And interestingly, we spoke last week about the importance of the Europa League to our clubs, and it really does look as though that competition has potentially kind of revitalised both Spurs and Arsenal seasons. It's perhaps difficult to sort of overstate how big that Benfica win could be for the Gunners, both in terms of keeping their season alive and also acting as a springboard for a bit of league form. But let's move on to Chelsea. Ball draw with United this weekend, although it wasn't without controversy, you know, refereeing decisions and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer scrolling through the Chelsea website before the game apparently and very unhappy with what he saw. But James, let's focus on the Blues attack and specifically Thomas Tuchel's criticism of now both Tammy Abraham and Cullen Hudson-Odoi in the space of a week. I mean, he's kind of quickly getting a reputation for being a straight talker, and I know you have appreciated that in his press conferences. But what's his thinking, you know, here with his latest remarks, and is it a sensible move in your view?
It's a tough one, this, because you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. You know, we're journalists, and we love it when managers and players are straight. And most of the time we complain and say, "Oh, why can't they just be honest with us?" You know, he is, and it's really refreshing. It's really disarming, and I've enjoyed his press conferences so far. Now, if you're on the wrong end of that, as in the players who is called out, then maybe it's not quite so enjoyable. That it was humiliating what he did to Callum Hudson-Odoi. That is kind of the ultimate humiliation for a footballer, isn't it? Brought on and then taken off. And I kind of got the feeling after that he regretted it, because in 2 press conferences afterwards, he was still bringing it up and saying, well, maybe it wasn't the right decision. And then when he brought him straight in for the Atletico Madrid game, you thought, has he maybe acknowledged that it was actually him who got it wrong on that count? With Abraham, look, this is it's not been pretty at all. Left out the squad completely yesterday. Twice he's taken him off after just 45 minutes. This is a young player, isn't it? And you can entirely limited to, but you can maybe look at the players that he's done this with, and it is the younger players, generally the younger profile. So that's Hudson-Odoi. He was taken off at half-time yesterday, and Tuchel made it clear that it wasn't just fitness, it was also tactical. So that's Abraham, that's Hudson-Odoi. Also, Reece James hasn't had much of a look in under him. Ben Chilwell, likewise. Okay, you can also say, well, what about Kante? Because he is an experienced player. But there's definitely a bit of a theme there that maybe these younger players, we don't know him well enough to know what his modus operandi is at the moment. But if it goes well, it's one of those where you'll say, great man management. If it doesn't, he might get a bit of the Jose Mourinho situation where people are accusing him of throwing players under the bus. But I just felt what he said about...
I was just about to ask you, actually, the way you're talking about him, and I haven't seen a huge amount of him. I did the Newcastle game at Stamford Bridge a couple of weeks ago, but apart from that, I haven't seen it a huge amount up close. But the way you're talking, a straight talker, is honest, makes halftime substitutions, doesn't mind hanging young players out to dry. Do you see any of Jose in Tuchel?
Well, if it's on paper, it was just on paper in black and white, then you'd say yes. But it is, with these things, it's all about delivery, So yesterday, even talking about Abraham, it didn't feel like, as he was saying it, that he was saying he's not good enough, he's this, he's that. It felt like it was still fairly nurturing. It was a case of, look, to be at Chelsea, you've got to expect these sort of things. I've got a really strong squad. All those things are true, of course. But and he says it with there's a bit of a lightness of touch with the way he talks. If it had been Jose, it had been monosyllabic and it had been dismissive and kind of spat out the corner of his mouth, as he can do on occasions, and have the frown, you'd say, oh yeah, I can't believe he's talking about a player like this. So it is all about the delivery, but the end result is the same. If Jose had done that, I think there would be far more headlines about it. Let's just say that. I also think that the key point here, though, is quite apart from anything else, it is really hard to play as a centre forward for Chelsea at the moment. No one has looked good in that position. They do not create many chances. They don't get the ball. Giroud scored that wonderful overhead kick in midweek, but that was literally out of nothing and pretty much the only thing Chelsea created. And it was from a mistake from the defender from Atletico. He's tried Mason Mount in a false number 9. He's tried Werner there, Abraham, Giroud. All of them look completely lost. So maybe he needs to be a bit honest with himself as well, Tuchel, and say, what's he doing wrong?
Do we think, James, that Tuchel is perhaps not just discovering the same thing Frank Lampard did, but just an accelerated rate where it doesn't look like he has a top-class striker, certainly of, a side that's going to win the Premier League, and Giroud is the best fit, and maybe that's, no one's as good as a striker, maybe because there isn't someone who is good enough to be Chelsea's number 9 for a title-winning or title-competing side?
Well, I thought Werner was that striker. His goals record is certainly that, and he can play through the middle, absolutely. As time's gone on, we're beginning to think maybe he needs to be a wide forward or slightly withdrawn forward, but he can certainly play right through the middle. That is not an issue. I would also say under Lampard, I'd go into games thinking Chelsea could hammer teams, particularly when Ziyech was on top form. You just thought there are goals everywhere in this team. With Tuchel, I think he's made them blunter as an attacking outfit. Now, that is a criticism of him. And I've also got to say, the way Chelsea play does make it very difficult for the attackers because they dominate possession so much that the opposition naturally falls back. So there's so little space for them to attack. And I think that is a huge part of it. And maybe he's got to I don't know what the way around that is, because of course City dominate possession and they cut you open in all sorts of ways. But that is definitely the issue. And a sort of traditional target centre forward, I just don't see that fitting in his team at all.
Going back quickly to the treatment of the younger players, I remember seeing, when he was appointed and people start sharing loads of interviews from previous jobs of what to expect from him. There was a bit that he was talking about how to deal with younger players and how, he'd want to put them in the position to do well. And you get a lot of managers saying it, never punish them for mistakes. Gareth Southgate says it lots. They keep trying and trying and trying. But the way he's behaved with Abraham, putting him off, I did a game at Southampton where he came off at half time, and it wasn't really Abraham's fault that he hadn't really had a sniff. Like you say, the ball just wasn't getting to him. No one was creating anything for him. And obviously Hudson-Odoi as well. They're going to be terrified to try things and pull things off now, because they'll just think in the back of his head that he'll hook them off. So, like you say, it could work and a bit of the stick could work, but it doesn't really fit with what he said in the past.
Yeah, I wonder with him. He's spoken quite a lot about his attitude towards young players at Chelsea, particularly because he came in after a manager who had given so many chances to young players. And he does seem like very much a supporter of having the club's youth come through. But he always balances that out, and he says, you've got to remember where you are. You're at one of the top clubs in world football, and to get into the team, you've got to deserve to be in the team. And, I think that is fair. But I totally take your point. They've got a £45 million striker who can't play up top. They've got a really experienced striker, World Cup winner in Giroud, who can't play up top, and they've got a young England international who also can't play up top. So you start looking at this and think, well, it can't be all of them, surely. Well, what I think is interesting is that he's talked about Messi before and that false number 9 and how he became the best striker in the world. But if you'd have said if you drew your ideal number 9, it wouldn't be Lionel Messi. That role was created for him. And I just feel like maybe that is the route he wants to go down, or he's thinking, because he's tried Mason Mount, for instance, in that kind of role. And maybe he does just realise that someone stood out there up top. He's not getting to them. So get the ball deeper, which Chelsea do, and see if you can hurt teams that way.
Mason Mount is the next Messi. Is that his plan?
That's the headline. Let's move on to some listener questions and do a bit of West Ham. Everyone loves Thomas Souček and Vladimir Koufal. They're just enthusiastic Czech men who love playing in the Premier League, from what I can see, and have looked like great signings. But you've been asked, Jack, by Picky029 on Twitter, is Koufal, given his price, the best signing the club's made in years?
It's not a high bar to beat, but he's up there. We've spoken a lot about how David Moyes has changed the recruitment around, and Koufal and Souček sort of exemplify what he wants to do.
You've got to include Payet in any discussion. That's kind of close enough. And
yeah,
there's been a few good signings, but is he really?
Simone Zaza, yeah. Well, he's definitely better than Simone Zaza, but he's up there in terms of the impact he's had on the team. Payet was fantastic, and you've got highlight reels galore of him and some fantastic memories and fantastic goals. But in terms of how he influences the entire team, the two Czech lads have brought a completely different enthusiasm. You're right; they look, both of them look like they've won a competition every week to go out and play in the Premier League, and they're just absolutely delighted to be there and give their all. They both run like there's no tomorrow. Souček did 17k in the game at Old Trafford in the FA Cup, which there was extra time, so you allow for that. But 17 kilometres is not human, really, in a game of football. And you saw Koufal's reaction at the end of the game at Man City. They run them really close. They probably deserved to take a point from City, and at the end he just collapsed to the floor, head in hands, and looked nearly in tears when he walked down the tunnel in front of us at the end of the game. So I think he's certainly up there, him and Souček, for the impact they've had in the last couple of years. You're not going to get many better signings. They've made them far more resilient, far more driven, and a far better side as well. So a couple more of them going forward, and we'll see where they can go.
Simon, you've got a question about Arsenal on Twitter from at AFC_DXN, perhaps a big Lee Dixon enthusiast. He said, will Lacazette stay this summer, and is there any chance he'll get a 1 to 2 year deal? Of course, Lacazette scoring a penalty, I think it was, against Leicester at the weekend. So will he stay and get a new contract?
Yeah, well, this is what we discussed a bit about, wasn't it? You know, players coming to sort of 30, 31 and what you do around their contracts and whether you extend them or you try and get rid of them. I think Lacazette is obviously going to be decision time in the summer. He's going to have 1 year on his deal. In terms of where the club stands at the moment, it's basically just been parked and it's going to be picked up in the summer and they'll decide then what's going to be done. I think it's probably the moment to move on from him. I can't see Arsenal giving him the sort of length of deal that he would want at that stage. You know, this is probably his last chance to get a decent longish contract at a club, and it's also not a right moment for Arsenal to say, okay, let's just keep him for a year and let him go on a free. We've already seen the damage they've done on that, so it'll be decided in the summer. But for me, I think it's probably the moment to move on and try and get some money for a player who would still command a fairly decent fee in the transfer market.
James, a question from Apia Kathir on Twitter. You may have covered this already, but briefly he asked, what's Abraham's best position?
Well, I think his best position is the one that he's being played in, which is a centre forward. Which I suppose if you're looking further ahead to his future at Chelsea, you wonder how much of a future he has if that's his best position. And that clearly doesn't really. Tuchel seems far from convinced about that. But as we said before, he's in good company in that. I think he's an intelligent player as well. He's good at dropping deep. He's good at holding the ball up. But like any centre forward, that type of set forward needs service, and Chelsea just are not providing it. Which is why it's interesting that Ziyech is playing so little and Pulisic is playing so little, because those are two players who can really provide crosses, and that's what Chelsea don't do anywhere near enough of.
Based on the last two questions, do we start banging the Abraham to Arsenal drum? He's holding out on a contract, and Arsenal might need a new number 9 come the summer. Wonder if that's one to keep an eye on.
You've read next week's running order. That's what you've done. You've got ahead of the game.
And finally, I've got a question on Twitter from Spursman 2010. I promise you, is not someone I've made up. A genuinely real person. Says, what's the situation with extending Bale's loan? How much would it cost to sign him permanently? I don't think a permanent signing would be on the cards in the summer. I think what could happen if Bale continued in a positive vein and this really was a turning point for him is I think the clubs could come to an agreement to extend the loan for another year, and that would obviously take him to the end of his Real Madrid contract, and they'd be able to leave the club on a free, which would suit them and suit him. So I think his agent has said that's a possibility, and I think that's the most likely scenario. But obviously, as we've discussed on the show, he's earning a lot of money, so that would be conditional on him, continuing to be decisive in the Premier League and Europa League, I think. Well, that's all we've got time for this week. We covered a lot of ground there. Thanks to Jack, James and Simon. We'll be back next week to discuss more Premier League action. Thanks for watching, and until then, bye-bye.